Right. All right, so welcome everyone, and today's talk is going to be resolved that the current body of scientific data supports an Earth that is less than 10,000 years old. And today joining us is Dr. Kevin Mark. We can start with a brief introduction. Kevin, if you could give us tell us a little bit about yourself.
Sure. I'm a dentist and I live currently in North Dakota. I moved down from Canada about a year and a half ago. And I am a practicing traditionalist Catholic. I am also quite involved with the Kolbe Center for the Study of Creation. And I am a Catholic convert. I've been Catholic for about maybe 6 or 7 years now. And I grew up Protestant, and just due to various doctrinal points, I ended up converting to the Catholic faith. And now with the Kolbe Center, I'm very much involved in trying to teach the reality of creation as opposed to evolution, as I had to take a lot of science courses in university on my educational path. I found the arguments for evolution lacking, and I am sincerely convinced that the Earth is not billions of years old, that it is only about 6,000 years old, and that this is a error that a lot of Christians have stumbled with. And so I'm happy to try to give evidence for what I think is the true version of reality.
All right, great, thank you. So to begin with, we will start, so just so that you're both aware of the time limits for this debate. So we're going to start with each of you will have a 20-minute opening statement, and then after, so Brenden will give the first opening statement, and then Kevin, you can have a 5-minute cross-examination period during which you can just ask Brenden any brief clarifying questions that you need to ask him before your opening statement. So that'll be 5 minutes, and then you'll give your opening statement. There'll be a cross-examination again, and then there will be 3 series of rebuttals. Each of you will have 5 minutes for each of your rebuttals, and then there will be 5-minute closing statements at the end. So without further ado, we will begin with Brendan's opening statement. So Brenden, you have 20 minutes starting now.
All right, I appreciate it. I want to start with a brief apology. I had planned to put together a slideshow that cited all my sources and included all graphics and technical details, and just life circumstances gone the way I wasn't able to actually get that all put together. So no slideshow this time, but I do hope when I upload this, since I do plan to upload this, that I'll have one put together and included. But I wanted to just start off briefly with a general methodology by which I'm approaching this topic. Right, so the methodology I'm using, the first is that for my side of this debate, my intention is to focus not on the theology of the question, but on the science of the question, right? So if the Earth is 10,000 years old, the Earth is 10,000 years old, whether God created it 10,000 years ago or not, whether the Christian God created it or not. If the Earth is older than that, the Earth is older than that, again, whether that God created it or not. So I'm not going to be getting myself bogged down in any theological points. Those are important, but they're not within the scope of this resolution, although I do believe that there is a debate planned coming up that will cover them. Similar to that, I'm not planning to discuss evolution in this. There is a preponderance of evidence that I could pull from there, but to do so would itself be enough content for a separate debate, which I believe is also planned. And so I shan't be getting into any of the biological evidence, the genealogical evidence, the genetic evidence, nor any of the transitional forms evidence. None of those. Those are just too big of a topic and shall be reserved for another time. And then lastly, I'm restricting myself here to the age of the Earth, not the age of the universe, right? So very specifically, things like background radiation, which I believe are good evidence for the universe itself being old. Well, the universe can be old and the Earth can still be a special creation 10,000 years ago. So proving the age of the universe doesn't prove the age of the Earth. So I will be specifically focused on the age of the Earth, and I will not be using, and I'll be using science and not theology. So I'm not trying to disprove Genesis in any way, and I won't be using evolution. And there are, even with this, and I expected with those criteria in place that I'd be arguing with one hand tied behind my back, as it were. But frankly, there was enough information here that I found it difficult to choose specifically which parts I wanted to focus on. And I could probably easily have made my 20-minute opening statement a 40-minute opening statement. So I'm going to try and be concise. The first issue that I want to bring up is a classic, radiometric dating. Right? If you're discussing the age of the Earth, this is very commonly brought up. And radiometric dating takes a number of forms. Right? Most people are familiar with radiocarbon dating because carbon dating is the one that you often hear about with archaeological artifacts, especially. So I debated on the Shroud of Turin last week. The Shroud of Turin was carbon dated, but we have other isotopes that we can use other than carbon, right? You have argon is one of the most common for that. There are quite a few others. Again, wish I had a slideshow so I could show the list there. But what I'm wanting to focus on is not necessarily the radiometric dating by itself, right? Because that talking point has been brought up over and over again. That talking point has been attempted to be discredited, but there's enough literature on that talking point that I feel I wouldn't be adding much to the discussion. What I would like to bring up is the way that the radiocarbon dating, right? So just in case anybody isn't familiar, radiometric isotopes decay. They are in a state that will generally gradually over time decay. We can study the rate at which they decay, and from that we can make projections for the rate that they have decayed. We can also then test in a laboratory to see if we can speed up that rate, and if we can, how and what the consequences would be. Radiometric decay releases minor amounts of radiation, right? That is how we get radiometric decay. And so the point that I would actually like to focus on is not the veracity of the radiometric decay itself and the radiometric dating, but is the point that is explored by a team of creationists, young Earth creationists employed by ICR, called the RATE Project. Because see, the funny thing happens if you study the radiometric decay, right? And we are able to tell that the isotopes decay at an appropriate rate. We are able to test in a laboratory whether or not that can be accelerated and by how much. We can get a decent idea of how much radio decay has taken place, and thus how much radiation has been lost from that. The RATE team studied this in an attempt to discredit radiometric dating. What they found is that really they couldn't. Right, the general conclusion of the RATE team is that the radiometric dating, the radiometric decay has occurred. Now they would then assert that the result of that decay was potentially the creation event itself, followed up by some accelerated decay from Noah's flood. The problem with that is that the amount of radioactive decay that would have to occur would release so much radiation into the Earth's atmosphere that no living thing would live at all, period, by several measures. This is known problem. This is a known problem that ICR Answers in Genesis has addressed. And their solution is simply, well, we don't know how this radiometric release happened. We don't know how this decay occurred. Maybe we'll figure it out, but we're still confident in the young Earth This is a fact that is easily explained if the age of the Earth is as old as scientists tell us it is. It is not easily explained if we take the 10,000 year model into account. Similar to that, we also have the heat problem, right? So the heat problem is a little bit easier to explain. Heat escapes when kinetic energy is at play. Just looking at the amount of energy that would have to be used to go from a monocontinent, right, a single continent similar to Pangea, to what we have today, which we know that a single continent must have been the case due to the migration of animals, due to the migration of humans, due to the migration or to the spreading of plants, right? For that to split apart to what we see today, the amount of heat that would release would be so exponential. There was and I'll have the study for this linked in my video, but there was a study that was done by a scientist who was curious about this very question, looking into how much heat would have to have been expelled based off of the amount of kinetic energy that we know. The surface of the Earth during the time of 10,000 years ago would have had to have been around 100,000 degrees, right? This is another data point that Answers in Genesis and the Institute for Creation Research have touched upon, right? The heat problem is known. Currently, there is no answer for it. There have been a couple of things that have been proposed as potential research topics, but those have also been addressed by the larger scientific community and shown to have been fallacious at their base. Right, so the radiometric and the heat problem, I find both of those to be similar, right? A large amount of radioactive decay, a large amount of heat being released, both of which would be enough to destroy the Earth many times over. But they're not my only arguments, right? Those are ones that have been thoroughly discussed, although I'm curious to hear Dr. Mark's response to them. The next one that I wanted to bring up is the amount of known plankton. Right, we know how much plankton is produced every year, approximately. We have good indications that the amount of plankton that's produced now is less than that was produced within a few hundred years. We can also go and we can look at fossils. We can look at the geologic column for the amount of plankton that has been produced and has died, right? That produces a lot of biomass. When you have biologic material that lives and then dies, it doesn't just vanish, it leaves mass. And we can look at that. We have had some of this plankton fossilized, and we can then go and study the plankton that have been preserved. And we see a couple of things that are really interesting, right? The first of these is that we see an alternation of plankton from saltwater to freshwater in the same general area, right? So scientists generally will use this to determine at what periods of time the ocean has what levels of salt content versus freshwater content. But this allows us to see kind of a general progression and give us a rough estimate to how much plankton would have had to have been alive at one point to now be dead and fossilized and preserved in the ways that it is, right? Plankton produces massive layers of fossilized rock. The amount of plankton that we know had to have existed at some point in our history is so vast that our best projections would, and again, I'll provide links for this in the description, but our best projections would be akin to the entirety of the ocean in the first few thousand years being just plankton. In order for that plankton to then get to the levels that we know that it was within recorded history because of things like fishing, right? The amount of plankton is just not consistent. I could do this with all of the species of animals that we know. That starts to border on breaking my rule on evolution, but just the number of species that we know existed would be so numerous that the entirety of the earth would have had to have been so utterly populated by creatures that you couldn't take a step without crushing several, right? Specifically because there is a period where we start to have enough recorded history that we can kind of tell based off of things like diet, things like recorded animal populations, hunting, whatever, what the animal populations were. So to fill the rest of the gap of unrecorded human history in a 10,000-year model with the number of species that we know existed is just not consistent. And then for the sake of time, the one other that I wanted to address is actually something I just found out about today. So I am going to do my best to summarize this because it was strong enough that I called an audible in the last minute and decided it needed to be talked about. And that is something called the orbital monsoon hypothesis. So the orbital monsoon hypothesis hypothesizes that given the current curvature, the current turn of the Earth, seasons over time will have changed and shifted, right? Assuming the world is a certain age, then we should be able to see this change and shift. And this change and shift would then be, if this is correct, we should be able to see this. Well, that's less important to me than the method by which they were able to research this, right? So when it rains, rainwater leaks through the cracks in the earth into cave systems, and gradually over time, that cave or that water calcifies. When it calcifies, it produces stalagmites and stalactites. When it calcifies, it also brings with it information, right? The water has passed through the atmosphere, hit the ground, and when it goes down, it saves with it information about, say, oxidization levels, various different, just information about the atmosphere. And so we can tell through the study of these stalagmites and stalactites what season it was when they formed, because through examination of this calcified water, we can see what the rainwater carried with it, what information it brought. And so you can do that. We've done this, with tests first to see, with recorded history, with the history we know, confirmed it to be accurate. They also did this in two locations, right? So they did this, at least two that I know of from the report that I was reading. One of them was in Brazil, a cave system in Brazil. The other was a cave system in China, because with the way that the Earth is tilted, seasons occur differently on the different hemispheres. If it's summer in the north, it's winter in the south, and vice versa. And what they found was that consistently studying the stalagmite, stalactite structures in the cave systems in China and in Brazil, consistently they were able to find that the results matched. When their results indicated it was summer in China, it was winter in Brazil. When it was summer in Brazil, it was winter in China, right? Based off of the consistent rain patterns. And they were able to find this consistently. And this is interesting. It's similar to the way that tree rings are interesting in that they can't form but with time, right? These are consistent. We can see consistently and have seen consistently that these calcify at a specific rate over time, and that in the summer they have this information, in the winter they have that information about the atmosphere, right? In the summer, if it's raining in one area, if it's raining in one season and it's dry in another, we can see that, again, similar to tree rings, except dissimilar to tree rings. Trees generally don't live as long. right? The oldest tree is theorized to be 10,000 years old, but there's very good reasons to doubt that assertion, right? They just don't live that long. But the caves have been around a lot longer. And in fact, the data that was demonstrated by the research teams that were looking at this, again, they were studying orbital tilt hypothesis, orbital monsoon hypothesis, with the potential for the monsoon seasons to have changed over time every, I think, 23,000 years. But what they were able to find is that through this dating method, they were able to get consistent results for, I want to say it was 120,000 years in China, 180,000 years in Brazil. I could have the two locations mixed, right? But regardless, both of them over 100,000 years with very consistent, predictable, repeatable results, where the seasons were very clear, very repeatable, right? So if we are going to assert that the Earth was created by, well, if we are going to try and look at this evidence, right, and we are assuming things like that the Earth is not simply 3 weeks old and that it was just created with all of our memories in place, right? If we're going to assume that the Earth was not, say, created by a trickster deity who would do everything that he could to then make it look like it was not created within that same time parameter, right? If we are going to say that we have laws of physics and that through the study of those laws of physics, right, we can then go and predict, because that's important for science, is not just a response, but a predictable hypothesis, right? If we can predict that we will find certain elements in an old Earth, and then we go and look at those elements, and we find that those elements are indeed exactly as the predictive model predicted, and if we can do that over and over and over again, then at some point we have to face the fact that at the very least, that the science does not support a young Earth. The science does not support an Earth that's only 10,000 years old. Now, if after that you want to theologically say that the Earth was, say, created with age, that is entirely an individual's prerogative and is the topic for another debate. But the science specifically does not support that. And then in the 20 seconds, 30 seconds, yeah, I'll go ahead and leave it there. There's much more that I could say, but for the sake of time, I'll go ahead and leave it there.
All right, thank you. So, before Kevin's opening statement, we have a 5-minute cross-examination period. So, Kevin, if you have any brief questions that you want to ask Brenden just to clarify things, or even if you just want to talk for 5 minutes, that's fine. And then we can go into the opening statement, which will begin with Hugh. So we have 5 minutes starting now.
Is during this segment, is Hugh able to do a cross-examination here?
Yeah, that would be fine if you'd prefer.
Well, our idea was that we would take turns and we could do it together.
Okay, yeah, that'd be
That's all
fine.
right.
Sure.
So, Brother Kevin, would you like to go first, or would you like me to go first?
You can go first, Hugh.
Okay, so if you can just give me 2 minutes and 30 seconds then.
Okay, sure.
So my first clarification is just that I think it was a little bit of a straw man to say that the Protestant creationists were trying to discredit radiometric dating. They weren't trying to discredit radiometric dating. They were trying to make sense of contradictions. And for example, way back in 1957, a very prominent chemist named Dr. Cook, who is famous for his work in the field of explosives, pointed out in the journal Nature a very remarkable observation, which was that if radioactivity had been taking place on the Earth for 4.5 billion years, it would produce a tremendous amount of helium as a byproduct of the radioactivity. So for example, when uranium decays to lead, it goes through 8 steps. And at every step along the way, helium atoms are being produced as a byproduct of the radioactive decay. And what Dr. Cook pointed out, and he's never been answered in the pages of Nature to this day, is that in the Earth's atmosphere, there is only 0.04% of the helium that should be there if this radioactive decay has been going on for 4.5 billion years. And like I said, he's never been answered. And this was one of the anomalies that the RATE team set out to explain. And of course, what they discovered is, by very careful experiments with zircons that they extracted from cores that were drilled out in the Los Alamos area, is that they found in zircon crystals the equivalent of 1.5 billion years of uranium to lead decay at the rate that it's measured on Earth today. But when they very carefully measured the amount of helium trapped in the zircon crystals, they did careful experiments to see how quickly helium diffuses out of the zircons at different temperatures, they concluded that at the rate that helium diffuses out of the zircon crystals, it was impossible for the original uranium to have been trapped any longer than 14,000 years ago, and more likely much closer to 4,000. That was the range. And so this was an anomaly that, like good scientists, they attempted to explain. So it's not that the creationists have a problem and they appeal to the Bible to get them out of it. Everybody's got a problem if your starting point is uniformitarianism. But
Okay, that's time.
uniformitarianism, okay.
Am I answering that with since the cross-examination? Do I have a second to answer that?
Sure, yes, that'd be fine.
Okay, just taking a second. I don't want to take time away from Dr. Mark. That's been thoroughly explored and thoroughly debunked. It has been in peer-reviewed papers. Scientists have explored that question, and it has been thoroughly found to have been unreliable. The method does still stand, but the issue has been looked at. I'm happy to provide resources for that. I don't want to take too much time, but that specific claim has been examined and has been debunked.
Okay, so 2 minutes and 30 seconds for Dr. Kevin Mark now.
Okay, so it seems to me that a lot of faith is being put in this research that was brought up, that was done by these scientists, because it seems as though this research is being trusted with a level of trust that it is not warranted. It's very obvious that scientists are incredibly fallible people that do research and ignore aspects of research that supports their own preconceived ideas. And so I can pretty much guarantee you, if you had scientists that were honest people going in with a worldview that was a young Earth, and they saw the exact same evidence that was being interpreted by the long age secular scientists, the young Earth scientists would interpret the data differently, the same data, and they would give you different answers, and they would be able to explain this data differently. And that's one thing that certainly became very evident to me going through university, is how biased people are, and how you absolutely cannot look at scientists as some sort of arbiters of truth, as if they are these sincere truth-seeking people that will follow the truth wherever it leads, because that's simply isn't the case. Much of science is agenda driven. We can see that very clearly with all of the COVID shenanigans, for instance, and the whole global warming alarmism and the transgenderism. The list goes on and on. I just think that it's would be a fault to act as though you can just pull some scientific thing out trying to prove a point on this and then act like it's entirely trustworthy, because obviously neither you nor I are experts in this field. We're simply reading a paper that is presented with whatever spin on it that the people doing the research want it to have. So
Okay,
I
that's
just think
time.
we have to be very careful with that.
And Brenden, do you have a very quick response?
Yeah, absolutely. Scientists lie. It happens, or are mistaken. And I could tell you, having researched this subject extensively, and again, this is a very brief response. I could get much more deep into this. Having researched this very deeply, I have found time and time again scientists lying about the data, and it has consistently been the ones claiming that the Earth is 6 to 10,000 years old, and they can be shown to be lying in every instance about the data that's presented, about what the data means, about how they gather the data, even so far as to doing tests that the entire scientific community knows don't work, and then when the test doesn't work, claiming to the public that this proves young Earth creationism. So yes, I definitely agree that scientists lie. I've definitely seen scientists lying. I have yet to see that level of dishonesty from the larger scientific community that I've seen from those asserting a young Earth. And data doesn't lie. And if the data can be replicated, if it can be tested, if people can challenge it, try to disprove it, and then come to the same conclusion, which we see often in the scientific community, then it seems like maybe it's not the scientists making an assertion, maybe the data is trying to tell us something.
Okay, so that will conclude the cross-examination period, and that actually went. I was a little lenient on the time control that time, so I think the next cross-examination will go 7 minutes, because I think this was more like 7 minutes. So now we can begin the opening statement for Dr. Kevin Mark, and Hugh Owen wanted to give. He wanted to speak for the first 10 minutes of that. And also, just so that you're all aware, I didn't mention this in the beginning, but in the chat box, I'll be giving periodic updates on how much time you have left. So there should be a chat button on the bottom of your screen. That way I can give you updates on how much time you have left without interrupting you. But then I'll let you know once your time is up. So with that being said, Hugh,
I
Owen,
need to share my screen. I need to share my screen.
Okay, yeah, it should be enabled. So do you see where the bottom or where that button is on the bottom that says share screen?
Yeah, I clicked on it.
Okay.
Just a second. All righty. Do you see it?
I think it's working. It's just starting to load up. Yeah, we can see it.
Okay, there we go. So we'll start the 10-minute timer now.
All righty. So the big question for us tonight is really which authority is trustworthy in regard to the age of the universe. Is it fallible, consensus, human science, or is it infallible divine science? Now, the Word of God and the tradition of the Catholic Church tell us that Moses wrote these and redacted the first 5 books of the Bible. And in the sacred history of Genesis, we learned that God created everything supernaturally. Now, it was the consensus view among biblical scholars and in academia generally 150 years ago that Moses did not write anything at all. and Julius Wellhausen and his disciples who pioneered what became the absolute consensus view still being taught all over the world was that there was no evidence of writing in the time of Moses, therefore Moses couldn't have written anything. Now, of course, archaeology advanced, and eventually archaeologists discovered that there was not only writing in the time of Moses, there was writing 1,000 years before the time of Moses. So the word of God, as understood in the church from the beginning, was vindicated, and the consensus view that's still being taught was falsified. Now, the consensus view today in natural science is that the Earth is 4.5 billion years ago, and that over 1 billion years of that time, life evolved through the same kinds of material processes that are going on now, whereas the Word of God and the tradition of the church tell us that life was created supernaturally and instantaneously by Almighty God. And that's been the constant teaching of the church. Now, we saw last week that the Holy Shroud of Turin was wrapped around a corpse. It's covered with post-mortem blood. That's indisputable. And we also saw that there was a flash of radiation from that corpse, equivalent to the effect of 14,000 excimer lasers that produced the image in 1/40 billionth of a second. That's certainly very consistent with the traditional teaching of the church that Jesus resurrected. That is life coming from non-life in a split second by supernatural power. There's no natural way to reproduce that. Our Lord also said he is the bread from heaven, that he brings life from non-life in the Holy Eucharist. There have been 153 Eucharistic miracles approved by the church over a period of 2,000 years. And in a number of them, he has given us visible evidence that, in fact, he does bring life from non-life in the Holy Eucharist. This is a picture of a host that bled in Buenos Aires, 1992. It was given to a leading expert in histopathology who concluded that it was tissue from a living human heart in extreme distress. The same tissue from the consecrated host was given to Frederick Zugebe, an expert in cardiac pathology and forensic medicine from Columbia University. He said it was tissue from a living heart in extreme duress, and he did not know what he was looking at when it was given to him. He was shocked when he found out that it was a consecrated host. So here again, we see that life came from non-life by the word of God instantaneously. A few years later in Sokolka, Poland, another host, bread, consecrated, began to bleed. The host was sent to two different independent experts in histopathology, and both of them concluded that it was tissue of a living human heart, as if on the point of cardiac arrest. There was no foreign substance added to the consecrated host to preserve it, and the structure of the heart muscle fibers was deeply intertwined with the bread in a way impossible to achieve by human means. So here we have visible evidence that God brings life from non-life supernaturally every day in the holy sacrifice of the Mass. But that's not all. We have 2,000 years of well-attested resurrection miracles where saints have brought people back from the dead even after they have been dead for several days. This is an account of one of St. Francis Xavier's many resurrection miracles, which were attested by eyewitnesses, including in two cases, the dead people themselves. In this particular instance, the man was wrapped in the shroud. His body had decayed, it stunk, but St. Francis had them unwrap the shroud. He prayed over the man in the name of Jesus, and he was raised immediately from the dead. So a corpse, a disorganized mass of chemicals, was instantaneously raised up the body of a living, breathing human being. This is repeatedly witnessed and attested to again and again over 2,000 years. Now, we all know that every living thing is full of complex coded information. This is a 2 TB hard drive. It can hold about 2 trillion bytes of information. But one pinhead of the DNA found in the nucleus of the simplest one-celled organism can hold as much information as 2 million 2 TB hard drives. Now, it's an axiom of information theory that a code can only come from a mind and a free will. And the atheists have never presented one single example where kind of code has arisen from chemicals without human intervention. Whereas we have looked at examples of supernatural God acting, bringing life from non-life instantaneously in several different ways. Now, the consensus view among peer-reviewed scientists in the field of genetics and biology for many years was that only the 2% of our DNA that codes for protein was functional. The other 98% was junk left over from the millions of years of evolution. Richard Dawkins went all over the world making atheists of people who didn't know enough science to understand that he didn't know what he was talking about. Dr. Maddock was one of the few who finally got the funding for Project ENCODE, which proved that not only is the junk DNA not junk, it operates at a higher level of functioning than the DNA that codes for protein. In fact, as Dr. Sanford has pointed out in his writings, the DNA sequences in all living things are so densely packed with information that you can take a DNA sequence, read it this way, it has one functional meaning. You can read the same sequence in the other direction, it has another functional meaning. Then you can take every other letter in the same sequence, it has a third functional meaning. Then you can translate that sequence into another language, it has a fourth functional meaning. This means that any mutations in these sequences are going to be at least somewhat harmful because the information is so densely packed. And this is why genetic entropy is a genetic reality, indisputable. There are evolutionists like Gutsick Gibbons and Swami Das and others who claim that they can refute this, but just go to the link that I'll show you in a few seconds, and you'll see that Dr. John Sanford and Dr. Robert Carter have completely refuted all of these critics, and they have never been able to answer any of the counter arguments. Now, genetic entropy means that mutations are building up in genomes. Every human being is acquiring 100 unique mutations in the germline that will be passed on to the offspring. All the so-called beneficial mutations that are in the textbooks, if you study them, actually break something, deregulate an existing function. Not a single one of them adds an entirely new function to the genome. And what is happening is this confers a short-term benefit on an organism, but in terms of its overall fitness and survivability, it's a negative. So we are not evolving into Superman, we are devolving. Dr. Nathaniel Jeanson took the empirically observed rate of mutation, not only in humans in the mtDNA, but also in fruit flies, in roundworms, and water fleas. And he was a good scientist. He took the evolutionary projections based on the time scale that Brenden defends as an established fact. And then he took the time scale derived from the sacred history of Genesis as believed in the Church of God for 2,000 years and all her authoritative teaching. And he looked to see which of these lines up better with the empirical data. And what he found was the number of mutations in humans, fruit flies, roundworms, and water fleas perfectly lines up with the biblical predictions based on a chronology of a universe or an Earth less than 10,000 years. It was completely out of the ballpark for the evolutionary predictions. If you want to see the refutation of Erica, Gutsick, Gibbons, Swami Das, and the rest of them, just go to creation.com, look up genetic entropy defense. And the bottom line is infallible divine science trumps fallible consensus human science every single time. In the name of Jesus, in the name of the Father, Son, the Holy Spirit, amen. Over to you, Brother Kevin.
Okay, it'll just take me a second to load this up. I think you just have to deselect the share screen.
Okay, I'll do that. I just did it.
Can you see mine?
Okay, yes, we can see that now. Great. All right, so I'll start the 10-minute timer now.
Okay. Did it take millions or billions of years for light to reach the Earth from the distant stars? Well, according to Physics World, one of the most sacred laws of physics is that nothing can travel faster than the speed of light in a vacuum. But this speed limit has been smashed in a recent experiment in which a laser pulse travels at more than 300 times the speed of light. So light can actually travel much faster than the so-called speed of light. A critical component of the Big Bang theory is the made-up idea of inflation. During inflation, the universe expanded by a factor of about 10 to the 26th power. This number is a 1 followed by 26 zeros. The Big Bang theory states that after the Big Bang, the universe expanded by a factor of 100 septillion in 100 nonilliths of a second. That's 1 over 10 to the power of 32, and this supposedly happened naturally. Nature has no ability to do this. Is it reasonable to ascribe this to nature? Why is this concocted idea considered worthy of belief, while the idea that light from the stars could reach the Earth during the creation week in less than a day is scoffed at? There's a big difference between nature, which is not all-powerful, and God, who is. The reality is nature can't create a single star. The idea of natural star formation is pure speculation. The same goes for planet formation. It is not reasonable to attribute the creation of stars and planets to nature. The origin of stars represents one of the most fundamental unsolved problems of contemporary astrophysics. So says Harvard astronomy professor Charles Latta and Harvard grad and astrophysicist Frank Hugh. The silent embarrassment of modern astrophysics is that we do not know how even a single one of these stars managed to form. So says textbook author of astrophysical concepts Martin Harwitt. Nature has never been observed to create a single dead planet, let alone the magnificence of Earth. It is not reasonable to believe that nature allowed gas to become dust, that became space rocks, that became a planet, that somehow got 326 million cubic miles of water on it, that somehow developed the most complex thing in the universe, the cell, that became a fish, that became a quadruped, that became an ape-like creature, that became male and female sentient human beings with the ability to think and love and have free will. Attributing this to nature is to make nature a god. Nature cannot do this. This is completely unreasonable. Radiometric dating is often used to disparage the biblical chronology. When rocks are dated using radiometric dating techniques, it must be remembered that no date is actually derived from the rock itself. All that can be measured are amounts of various elements in the rocks. Everything else is an extrapolation using various contrived calculations that result in a date that is dependent on the preconceived formulas used for the calculation. Dating rocks using radiometric means relies on many assumptions: the assumed beginning concentration of parent and daughter elements, the assumed constant rate of decay, and it must be a closed system, no gain or loss of parent elements or daughter elements over time. If any of these variables are altered, the dates will not be accurate and could be off by a factor of 200,000 times, as seen in the following table. Mount St. Helens went off in 1980. In 1992, Dr. Steve Austin took samples and sent them into an independent laboratory for analysis. These samples came back hundreds of thousands of years old, and one of them came back 2.8 million years old, even though we know these samples were only 12 years old. Can radiometric dating be useful? Yes, particularly if it can be reliably calibrated with items of known age. And with carbon-14 dating, we can do this to some extent, and thus it can be useful. C14 can only last about 100,000 years, and if there's any C14 remaining in something, it is definitely less than 100,000 years old. There have been measurable amounts of C14 found in coal, in diamonds, and in dinosaur bones. Coal from strata allegedly ranging in age from 37 million to 318 million years dates at 44,000 to 57,000 years with carbon dating. Diamonds, allegedly 1 to 3 billion years old, date to 55,000 years old with carbon dating. Carbon-14 in dinosaur bones that is allegedly 65 million plus years old, when dated with carbon-14 dating, we see the range of dates between 20,000 and 30-some thousand years old. You can see the list of dinosaur bones that have been tested using carbon-14 dating. This proves that these items are not as old as commonly believed. Now, why don't these exactly fit the biblical chronology? The Earth's magnetic field would have been far stronger before the flood, greatly reducing the C14 in the atmosphere due to its shielding effects. And this lack of C14 would result in inflated dating results, that's the actual numbers, are actually low enough to fit the biblical chronology. This article can be found online. New data reveals that the magnetic field is actually weakening at 5% per decade, or 10 times faster than previously thought. This finding simply doesn't work with millions of years, but works perfectly with a 6,000-year-old Earth. There are many ways to attempt to date the Earth, and most give ages far less than 4.5 billion years. The Earth's magnetic field has been decaying so fast that it couldn't be more than about 10,000 years old, as said. Helium is pouring into the atmosphere from radioactive decay, but not much is escaping. The total amount in the atmosphere is only about 1/2000th of that expected if the atmosphere were really billions of years old. The moon is receding from the Earth at about 1.5 inches per year. If we extrapolate that backward, the upper limit for the moon's age is only about 1/3 of the conventional age given to it. Salt has been found to be pouring into the sea through rivers much faster than it is escaping. The sea is not nearly salty enough, however, for this to have been happening for billions of years. Extrapolation indicates the seas could not be more than 62 million years old, much younger than the billions of years believed by evolutionists. And of course, these dates are only the maximum age, not the actual age. As mentioned by Hugh, there has been found that zircons have massive amounts of helium inside them, even though we know the rate of helium diffusion, and it doesn't match up at all with the supposed ages of these items. Zircons, therefore, cannot be more than 6,000 years old based on the known rate of helium diffusion. Short period comets, another good example. Comets can only survive a certain number of orbits before their icy material evaporates and runs out of material completely. If the solar system were billions of years old, there should be no comets left. Population growth is another thing that confirms the sacred history of Genesis. If you use 4,500 years since 8 people came off the ark and just plug it into the population formula using the known growth rate for humanity over the past, say, 400 years, you get a reasonable result, 6.5 billion years, or 6.5 billion people. While if you use 200,000 years, starting with 2 people, you get a result of infinity, even at 100,000 years. This is more than the number of protons, electrons, and neutrons in the entire universe. There is no possible way you could have population rates maintaining themselves at 0 growth for so long and have this reflect reality. We can see that soft tissue has been found in dinosaur bones, including intact blood vessels. Mary Schweitzer says it was exactly like looking at a slice of modern bone, but of course I couldn't believe it. I said to the lab technician, the bones are, after all, 65 billion years old. How could blood cells survive that long? She says, when you think about it, the laws of chemistry and biology and everything else that we know say that it should be gone. It should be degraded completely. And yet, rather than reevaluate the age, these long ages are believed, and instead we reevaluate all the laws of chemistry and biology and everything else we know. This is a stone that, if you look closely, has a picture of a dinosaur on it. It was found in situ with about 30 eyewitnesses to the stone's discovery. If we look closer, it has a picture of a dinosaur on it. This cannot be disputed based on all of the eyewitnesses that this was pulled out of a grave site and was dated to be centuries and centuries old. The only reasonable explanation is that the person saw this creature, and as we can see through artwork throughout the world, there are many depictions of what appear to be dinosaurs or dragons. Why would that be? Well, this is an intact skin of a dinosaur that was found in Alberta, and as you can see, it looks just like a dragon. The most reasonable explanation is that people actually saw these creatures, and that explains why almost all cultures in the world have stories of these types of creatures that they call dragons or some other explanation or name for such creatures. Amazing how dragon-like this dinosaur looks. It is not reasonable to believe that the just so naturalistic creation story of the evolutionists. Nature simply cannot do the fantastical things ascribed to it. It is far more reasonable to put one's faith in Almighty God than in the speculations of fallible scientists who attribute to nature that which nature is known not to be able to do.
All right, and that is time. So now we will move on to the next section, which is a cross-examination. So Brenden, you can either address your questions to Hugh, Owen, or to Dr. Kevin Mark, and we'll shoot for around 5 to 7 minutes. We'll see how it goes. So, all right, starting now.
Okay, Hugh, a couple of questions for you. So you said that there was that historians, scholars were saying that there's no evidence of writing. I want to just clarify, you meant Hebrew writing specifically, right? Not just writing in general?
No, in the time of Wellhausen, they didn't have evidence of writing such as Moses was alleged to have done in the time of Moses.
Like the hieroglyphs and the pyramids that we had 3,000 years before Moses?
They weren't talking about that kind of writing. They were talking about the writing that we find in the sacred history of Genesis. They claimed that that kind of writing did not exist in the time of Moses, and it did. And eventually that was acknowledged.
No, I'm still curious though, like what kind of writing? Like, you mean like religious texts? Are you meaning Paleo-Hebrew? Are you meaning like what do you mean that kind of writing?
He means like alphabetic writing, not hieroglyphs.
Okay, so alphabetic as in Paleo-Hebrew specifically, or alphabetic as in non-Pictionary?
Alphabetic as in the kind of writing that we see in ancient Hebrew today. And there's a scholar named Petrovich who's now making a very good case that Hebrew was actually the first written language, and that it was actually created in Egypt before the time of Moses. Anybody who wants to look it up can look it up and look at the arguments on both sides. But we believe that Petrovich makes an excellent case, and he's an expert in all the relevant disciplines that one needs to bring to bear to the question. And that would mean, of course, that Moses coming along several hundred years after the time when this Hebrew script was developed would have been able to make use of it.
Interesting. Okay. Sure. I'll address that in my briefly in my rebuttal. I won't go any further into that. Just a couple of points of clarification. You said that the shroud in the shroud conversation last week, it was proven that the blood was post-mortem and that the image was put into place by a blast of radiation. I just wanted to as a point of clarification, to my knowledge, it was never asserted that it was specifically post-mortem, because I was prepared to answer that. And the blast of radiation was mentioned as a possibility for it, as opposed to definitively, or blast of light, right? The laser point was mentioned, but it was never conclusively like set down. This is exactly how it was put there. So it was just point of clarification for anybody who didn't watch that debate. Okay, and then Dr. Mark, so you had a quote from 1986 about how we don't know how the planets formed. Are you aware of anything more modern, anything a little less like 30 plus years ago, anything like what's the modern consensus? Do you know if that still remains true, or is that outdated at this point?
That is just as accurate today as it ever was. However, it is not something that you're going to find every day put as candidly as it was there. The reality is, generally speaking, scientists who hold to the atheistic version of the creation of the universe will not admit such things, because it is damning to their argument to admit ignorance, even though it's honest. So it's not very common that you come across an admission like that in the literature.
Just checking. Are you aware that the origin of the universe currently proposed of the Big Bang was not only not atheistic, but it was in fact developed by a Catholic, strong practicing Catholic?
It certainly is true that it was developed by, at least in part, by Georges Lemaitre. However, he was not a faithful Catholic.
Okay. Would you say, actually, I do want to follow that up. Would you say that he was an atheist then, that he just didn't believe God existed at all?
No, he definitely was not an atheist. He would be what I would consider a compromising Catholic.
Then would you still consider it fair to say that the current asserted model of the origin of the universe is the atheistic model when it was not developed by, when the lead in that model was not at all an atheist, nor were most of the people on his that he worked with?
Well, I would say that the model that Georges Lemaitre developed is not identical to the model being used today. I mean, he talked of this kind of cosmic egg idea where the creator kind of packed everything into this singularity, and it blew out from there, where he's adding the theistic spin on things, while the current version would have no room for such an idea.
Right, because the current version doesn't make any claim on what packed it there. It just simply says that it did. Like, I'm just concerned that that's poisoning the well there, of saying it's atheistic when in fact the same idea was developed by theists. It just seems like that's a little bit of putting the cart before the horse there, where you're prejudging the model, again, poisoning the well. You can either believe the atheistic view or you can believe the Christian view when the Christian came up with the atheistic view. But besides that, since I only have a couple of seconds, just briefly, two things. Do you have a citation for the cell being the most complex thing in the universe? And your known growth rates for human population? So that's 400 years?
I believe that is from approximately the last 400 years of human existence, because that's all we have any type of data on, basically, to base that on.
Okay.
All right, that
And
concludes
regarding the cell, I don't have a citation for you. However, I think that is a highly accurate statement, because I can't imagine anyone putting forth any other thing that could reasonably be said to be more complex than the cell.
Okay,
Unless you
so
have one for us.
So Brenden, now your 5-minute rebuttal number 1 begins now.
Sure. So just briefly, hieroglyphs existed before Hebrew writing. Cuneiform existed before Hebrew writing. Right. This is getting into my field of expertise. Whereas science has been a hobby that I've picked up, this is my field of expertise. We absolutely had writing before Moses. Nobody's ever asserted that we didn't. The assertion was that we didn't have Paleo-Hebrew, right? Because Hebrew is not the original version of Hebrew. We had Paleo-Hebrew. We have found what we believe to be some samples of Paleo-Hebrew writing from around the time of Moses. However, we're not actually sure. There's some issues with where it was found and coming up with a conclusive date. We certainly haven't found a lot of samples. And there is no good evidence that it came out of Egypt, since Egypt had several working alphabets at that time. Although it does belong to the same family group as some that we have in Egypt that comes out of kind of of that. You mentioned that we have not been able to discover new code being created code being created out of non-code or something similar to that without human intervention. No, we wouldn't expect to. Very specifically, the model for abiogenesis, which is kind of what I think you're alluding to there, necessitates that the Earth be in a different state than it is in now, right? Like the chemical compound makeups, the conditioning that would have to be the case. However, we have replicated those conditions in a laboratory and have seen that when those conditions are replicated, they do self-assemble, right? Like all of the building blocks to life being created self-assembles. But again, unfortunately, Hugh, much of what you talked about was on the evolution side. So other than that, I am really not interested in getting into the evolution side nor the miracle side. None of it has to do with the age of the Earth. Well, the evolution side does, but separate debate. Genetic entropy as well. The genetic entropy point is been debunked multiple times. I'm happy to get into that on the evolution conversation if you would like to bring that up in our future evolution debate. But it's ridiculous. Anyways, but switching more to the Dr. Mark's side of things, yeah, we have very good evidence for how the planets were formed. We have very good assertions. We have very good data for that, especially with recent developments of the microscopes, right? Like 1986, we have so many, I said microscopes, we have so many invented telescopes since then, right? We have so much extra data since then. Like the modern cosmological theories are so much more advanced than 1986. The reason you can't find a concise version of that is because we have really good evidence for how planets are formed. We even just recently got to like see a star eat a planet. Really cool. But we have a lot of that. Certainly we at least have enough information based off of what we have been able to find to assert very plausible and realistic explanations for how it could happen. There'd be no comets left. I find that one to be specifically like odd. Is there like a finite number of comets? Do we like know how many comets existed in the universe? Was there like a cluster of comets in one little spot, and the fact that there's still more of them like seems more reasonable to just assume that, as with like the rest of the world, or like as other things are forming and evolving, right, that more comets can form. Like the existence of comets could just be because more comets have formed rather than that there's like a clump of them. Carbon dating errors, yes. It's similar to how if I look at my time right now and I see 7:15 and I mistake my clock for a calendar and think that it's the year 7:15, yeah, you can use a radiometric test outside of the scope of the radiometric test. The way that the test is designed will still give you a number. It's just going to be completely false. This is a common argumentative tactic that I see with young Earth. The two other brief ones to address, known growth rates in the last 400 years. Yeah, human life expectancy has gone up significantly in the last 400 years. That last 400 years is not a good sampling size to be able to discuss human growth rates from Noah's flood, right? We have things like the Black Death. And very lastly, number one, Mary Schweitzer would be appalled to hear you using her work like that. She has multiple times said that this is absolutely not indicative of young Earth, and that people who do say that it is don't understand her findings at all. And then she has done multiple experiments and written quite a bit explaining how pieces of fossilized DNA, not living tissue samples, but fossilized DNA were found within, or not even DNA, sorry, like pieces of tissue were found in the dinosaur, in the bones, and how that is entirely within the scope and expected by the evolutionary and old Earth model. The person who found this did not believe that this was evidence for a young Earth and is horrified that it's used that way. And then I'm sorry, but the Ica stones, those are not, well, yes, those are all fake. The people who made them said that they make them and then demonstrated how they made them and made them look exactly like they were made. And several of the dinosaurs on them contain errors that we didn't know because of the incomplete fossil record at the time that we have since learned, indicating also that the dinosaurs were replicated from the modern literature and definitely were not actually seen. So I'm sorry to have gone over, but that was my rebuttal.
All right, yeah. So That was about 6.5 minutes. So Kevin, you have your rebuttal number 1, and you can also have about 6.5 minutes. I'll start that now.
Oh,
Brother
was
Kevin,
Hugh, did you want to go first there?
sure, whatever you like, but so then we each have 3 minutes and 15 seconds, is that right?
Yeah, that will.
Okay, sounds good. So yeah, okay, I can go first. I'm just gonna share my screen for a minute, a second here. Regarding getting back to planetary formation, well, the secular widely expected theory of planet formation, called the planetesimal hypothesis, states that planets formed out of cosmic dust grains that collided and stuck to form larger and larger bodies. When the bodies reached approximately 1 kilometer, they can attract each other directly through their mutual gravity, enormously aiding further growth into moon-sized protoplanets. The problem is that this is a hypothetical situation and a supreme example of a just so story. According to nature, dust grains coalesced into planetesimals, objects of 1 to 1,000 kilometers in diameter, through an unknown process. That doesn't exactly sound like we know in great deal what happened. The formation of planetesimals, the kilometer-sized planetary precursors, is still a puzzling process. The process by which sub-micrometer-sized protoplanetary dust particles evolved to kilometer-sized protoplanetesimals is still enigmatic, according to the Annual Review of Astronomy and Astrophysics. One of these was from 2009, one from 2008. Just how did planets in the solar systems develop? Once these planetesimals have been formed, further growth of planets may occur through their gravitational accretion into larger bodies. Just how that takes place is not understood. We have seen that we know very little about the development of the solar system, and this is in a later edition from the candid Martin Harwitt, Astrophysical Concepts textbook author. So it's completely erroneous to suggest that we understand this process in any way. And in fact, it is pure speculation. Getting back to C14 dating, it will not just give you a number if it is wrong. It will come back that this is older than 100,000 years old, that it did not have enough carbon-14 to compute. That's reality. That's the way carbon-14 dating works. The fact that they all came back with appropriate amounts tells you that this is real, because these samples were handled in the proper way. And we can say that, Hugh and I, because we know how these samples were handled. We were Hugh was more directly involved in it than I was, but we know the people that knew what they were doing and handled these samples well. Mary Schweitzer is very compromised. She, of course, is bought in every way to the long ages. She's not about to get all of her scientific funding taken from her, which would happen to her if she jumped camps. So of course she's going to cling to any possible explanation, but common sense tells us you aren't going to have soft tissue, pliable tissue, blood vessels that look like they came from a cat that died a week ago, and this somehow is supposed to last 65 million years. It's just ridiculous that anyone can actually believe that. And regarding the ecostones, I specifically picked one that can't be refuted. This was found in situ with over 30 eyewitnesses. Have there been faked ones? No doubt there have been. And of course, the evolutionist camp jumps on that and says, oh, aha, they're all fake. In almost any real item from antiquity, you have faked versions of it. If we just examine the fakes, of course, we're going to say, oh, yeah, this is fake. No, you have to be able to distinguish the fake from the real. One of the ways is having patina on it, which, of course, that sample had, because there's eyewitnesses that was pulled right out of the grave. So there are, very good explanations for all of these things, and they can't just be dismissed with a wave of the hand. And that goes for all of the dinosaur art, the dragon art, the tales of dragons that come out from the past. You can't just say everyone in the world is just some ignoramus.
All right, so there's actually about 2 minutes left. That was a little overtime, but so Hugh, you can go for another 2 minutes.
Yeah, I'm going to address myself to the audience. I think, my friends, you can see that Brenden repeatedly says such and such has been refuted and then moves on to the next thing. So we're going to invite you to look at the arguments on both sides and decide for yourself. With regard to the research with helium retention in zircons, Dr. Russ Humphreys has refuted all of these so-called refutations. And you don't need to take our word for it, but certainly you shouldn't take Brendan's word for it either. Read Dr. Humphreys' response to his critics, and you'll see that he has answered them and refuted their refutations. Now, we have given examples where a supernatural origin of life is the most logical explanation. It's the most logical explanation of the evidence from the shroud. It's the most logical explanation for the Eucharistic miracles. It's the most logical explanation for the many resurrection miracles. All we asked Brenden to give us was one example of code arising from chemicals. His argument is that the scientific evidence supports his atheism. And if atheism is true, enormous amounts of coded information arose from chemicals without any intellect or will being involved. Now, all of a sudden, it's okay for him to say, well, the conditions in those first hundreds of millions of years were different. My friends, is that science? That's religion.
All right, that's time there. So now, Brenden, your rebuttal number 2 begins now. You have 5 minutes.
Yeah, goodness. Okay, so Hugh, I'm going to start with you because most of what you, just very briefly. Yeah, the reason I'm not providing the citations is because I have 5 minutes in rebuttal. I'm sorry, I can't cover 20 minutes worth of material. I can't even really cover 5 minutes worth of material in any kind of adequacy and provide all of the relevant citations. I am happy to provide them. I will, in fact, include them in the link or in the description of this video. But yes, I've personally read the studies. I'm happy to provide those, but yes, it's been refuted. The stating the supernatural being the most logical, yeah, the reason why that has been uncontested is because that was not the scope of the argument today. And I'm not going to spend any more time on that. We're discussing the age of the earth. Whether or not a supernatural origin to life is more reasonable is something I'd be happy to debate. It's not this debate. And I am similarly also not debating for atheism. That's a different debate also. This is over the scope of the age of the earth. As I previously stated in my last comments, the scientist who put together the Big Bang Theory was a Catholic, right? At the very least, he was a theist. I'm not arguing for atheism. So all 3 of those points were entirely irrelevant to the scope of this debate. Dr. Mark, touching on a couple of yours real quick. First of all, Wikipedia is not a good source. Seeing Wikipedia as a citation there. You did provide others, so I'm not going to harp on that as much as I had been planning to, but man, Wikipedia is not a good source. Yes, what aren't you being told about astronomy? So this is one of the things that I see consistently. When I look into young Earth creationists, traditional age creationists, right, people who are asserting that the Earth is 6,000 to 10,000 years old, I very often see quotations taken completely out of context by people who are lying to their audience. And the whole "what aren't you being told about astronomy," that book that these quotations were being pulled from, quoting other sources. You notice the ellipses, you notice the lack of context. Like, I see this all the time where they will go into books and they will take quotations out of context. Very often they like to do it out of like abstracts, right? Where you have a scientific paper that is talking about, hey, this has been a problem. Here's how we dealt with it. And then the conclusion is where they talk about how they dealt with it. They'll take quotations out of the abstract saying, this is the problem we're discussing. They'll be like, look, see, this is a problem, even though the paper then goes on to thoroughly deal with the problem. See this all the time. It's quote mining. Furthermore, my goodness, you just kind of, I'll deal with the Ica stones first. Yes, from what I understand, he made the stones and then buried them so that people could see them being dug out and testify to their veracity. I mean, how many eyewitnesses also saw the Book of Mormon being, translated or all right, like the gold plates, like the fact that a lot of eyewitnesses saw something, first of all, doesn't mean that those eyewitnesses themselves weren't wrong or lying. And second of all, with something like this, again, he could just have buried the stones and then had them dug out. But regardless, that one specifically, looking at it, doesn't look like any dinosaur that I recognize, but it does quite a bit look like some of the reptiles that I know were from that region, which is what most dinosaur art that we see from antiquity it can be easily explained by local fauna. Lastly, my goodness, just throwing out there that Mary Schweitzer is just compromised, right? That she is definitely trustworthy when she says the things that I agree with, and then as soon as she says the things I don't agree with, oh, she's compromised. Ridiculous. If she really didn't, like the assertion that, well, she would lose her job, she would lose her funding. ICR, Answers in Genesis, they would snatch her up in a heartbeat, pay her quite a bit of money. There's a lot of money. 41% of the population of America doesn't believe that the Earth is only or is older than like 10,000 years. There's a lot of money in that. And in fact, more probably than being a scientist, as has been demonstrated. And your characterization of what they found is just false. Yeah, it was somewhat soft and pliable after it had been soaked in acid for an extended period of time, and the blood vessels definitely didn't just look like a cat that died a week ago. Again, she thoroughly explains all of this. Doesn't just assert that that's not what she found, but she then follows that with data and experiments that demonstrate exactly how those were preserved, that demonstrate what parts of them were preserved, and thoroughly refute that. Yeah,
All right.
That's.
All right, that's time. So Kevin and Hugh, you have 5 minutes and 30 seconds. Rebuttal number 2 begins now.
Brother Kevin, do you want to go first, or would you like me to?
Yeah, Hugh, you can go first, please, Hugh.
Okay, so the arising of code from chemicals is actually very relevant to our topic, because according to your thesis, the first billion years, one of the great things that was accomplished was that code arose from chemicals. If that didn't happen, it calls the whole chronology into question, because we know that in reality, the second law of thermodynamics applies to all physical systems. And what you asserted is simply false. The fact that Miller-Urey experiment and similar experiments can create an artificial environment and produce amino acids, some of them, is not the same as producing code that conveys meaningful information. You've yet to provide a single example of what has ever been observed in nature or in the laboratory. And this is a fatal flaw in your whole scenario, because in that scenario, the first billion years of Earth's history resulted in this naturalistic miracle taking place. The other thing is, you are grossly mischaracterizing the carbon-14 dating situation. Everything that's been tested for carbon-14 virtually in the entire geological column has tested positive for carbon-14. We've gone to world-class geoscience conferences, and nobody's been able to refute our findings. The fact of the matter is, you cannot explain why the coal and the dinosaur bones contain substantial amounts of carbon-14, except in a much shorter time frame from the Earth than the one that you're arguing for. And we've challenged the scientists from the AGU. You've got access to dinosaur bones. Do the tests and prove us wrong. Nobody's ever proven us wrong. So what you're asserting is disingenuous. You go to some of your atheist friends who have access to dinosaur bones and ask them to be good scientists. Ask them to carbon-14 date the dinosaur bones and report back to your audience and tell us what they find. They're going to find that the dinosaur bones contain carbon-14, and there is no explanation for why they contain carbon-14 that is reconcilable with your thesis that the Earth is millions of years old.
All right, we can switch over to Kevin.
Okay. First, just regarding that Wikipedia, that obviously that was only given as a representative of the common thought. It was not at all arguing my position, so it's not fair to suggest that I somehow used this in a way that I shouldn't have. Secondly, the quotes that I took, they speak for themselves. I mean, yes, it's true. Quote mining is very common. And do I have no doubt that the author is not trying to argue a young Earth? Absolutely. That is why I'm taking secular quotes, because you would probably just dismiss any creationist quote that I give. But my point is that if you delve into the literature, you can find certain candid admissions that show that scientists don't know as much as they think they do. And as you get into more science and as you read more science, you begin to discover, as I said in the beginning here, that there is very little that you can actually trust that hasn't had some sort of spin put on it. Yeah, you can go into it and you can figure it out if you're willing to put in that effort, but you have to be very careful with what is a spin put on it by an author and what is irrefutable evidence and proof. And regarding Mary Schweitzer, I mean, whether it's her or whether it's any other scientist that is involved in a field that is obviously completely on the long ages side of things, of course it would destroy such a person's career for them to decide all of a sudden, wait a minute, we have to throw out the dates and reevaluate this. I mean, I think almost anybody will admit that that would destroy someone's career. Is it possible they could get a job somewhere with Answers in Genesis? Maybe so, but I think most people would still consider that a destroyed career from the secular community anyways. So yeah, there is good reason why people don't come out on the other side of things, because there's a very heavy weight of people around them keeping them in check.
All right, Brenden, your rebuttal number 3 begins now.
Hugh, for the third time. The reason I've not provided an example of that is because that's not what we're talking about. We are not talking about the origins of life. We are talking about the age of the Earth. I'm fine with somebody trying to assert that, especially for this conversation, that the Earth is several billions of years old, and that abiogenesis didn't happen. God just created life himself. The start of life in no way deals with this. That's not what we're talking about. Also, according to your thesis, my thesis has nothing to do in this debate, as I stated at the beginning, with the origin of life. We are talking about the age of the Earth. That's it. Specific. Does the scientific data support the age of the Earth? How life developed is outside the scope of this conversation, and that's why I have not been responding to it. It's not because I don't have anything. It's because that's not this debate. As far as the carbon-14, yeah, yep. People, some young Earth creationists did carbon date some dinosaur bones and indeed found carbon-14. In fact, specifically, they posed this chemists to obtain the dinosaur bones falsely. We're told when they received the dinosaur bones had been contaminated with, I can't remember, shellac, something that has carbon in it. Brought the dinosaur bones to get them tested, had them tested, and had them found that, yeah, there's carbon. And then they were told, but, you know, because these are contaminated, they don't even have any collagen in them. Because at their core, repeatedly, over and over again, demonstrably, these young Earth scientists doing this research are dishonest. But if you want further discussion on that, there is a preponderance of discussion on carbon-14 dating, how it's done correctly, and there are plenty of responses to everything that the scientists have said about carbon-14. But let's say, yeah, okay, we can like, let's go with the carbon-14, right? Carbon-14, if we go with like known carbon-14 decay rates, right, and we stay within the scope of just, you know, easier things to date, carbon-14 is accurate dating up until about 40 to 50,000 years ago, right? We can carbon-14 date things that are 30 years old, which is 3 times older than the dates that have been, than this conversation is trying to discuss as far as the age of the Earth, right? Things that we can say, absolutely, this is being handled correctly and carefully. This is biologic material, free of contaminant, and is being carefully tested and checked. And we still get dates older than 10,000 years. Briefly wanted to talk about the very little you can trust without spin. Sure, okay. If there's spin, right? Let's like, logically speaking, if there's potentially spin, which, by the way, there are, and there's a great debate that I will try and remember to put in here, that actually specifically looks at, because you can look at whether or not there's spin in specific articles. They looked for whether or not there is, you know, spin that's not trustworthy amongst like the scientific papers, and found that there isn't any noticeable. But let's just say that potentially, sure, maybe. Then it's at least true that maybe there's also spin from the young Earth creationists, maybe from the traditional age creationists, right? Maybe those scientists are producing things with their bias that isn't accurate to the data. Maybe they themselves are the ones who are being deceitful or misunderstanding the data here. And if we then go into, okay, well, how would we check that? How would we know, right? Well, we would know by, can we take the findings of these people and then replicate them? When we replicate them, what do we find, right? And we find consistently that these people are refuted on every talking point. But importantly, I still haven't heard any response to something like the stalactite stalagmites, right? The fact that those can be dated to over 100,000 years by just simply counting the rings, essentially, to borrow from trees, which I find to be also another compelling argument, right? Lots of doubt being tried to be thrown on the 99% of scientists, while expecting me to trust the 1% saying the other things and making a lot of money off of it, I will add. But right. With that.
That is time. All right, so Hugh and Kevin, now you have 5 minutes for your rebuttal number 3.
Would you like me to go first, Brother Kevin?
I can go first. That's fine. Thank you.
All right.
Okay, regarding stalactites, stalagmites, it's not complicated how these are generally dated. They look at the current rate of deposition, and then they just extrapolate that out. And so it's assuming a constant rate of deposition for millions of years, which is an outrageous idea. I mean, are we to believe that the drip that happened from the ceiling coming down was coming down in the exact same place for millions upon millions of years with no movement? That's outrageous. In addition, these caves were clearly formed by massive amounts of water rushing through some sort of process that obviously isn't happening today. I was recently in the 5th largest cave in the world in South Dakota, and these massive cavities, the only thing that made any sense, and even secularists acknowledge this, is that this got washed out by water. So the flood is certainly a very plausible scenario as to why you would have all of these massive caves that got washed out. This certainly wouldn't have happened through slow moving water either. So you have to have some rapid moving water. In addition, a great deal of sediment involved. Again, the flood meets these scenarios. So for one to put their evidence and trust in what the scientists tell you regarding extrapolation on stalactites and stalagmites, I really don't think that that's worthy of trust. I'm going to put it over to Hugh.
Okay, so Brenden has made a claim in a public forum that all the carbon-14 dating results with dinosaur bones were fraudulent, involving contamination, were not legitimate. This is a very serious claim. And at our next meeting, I will provide documentary evidence that will prove that he has slandered the Kolbe Center scientist who did carbon-14 dating of dinosaur bones. And I'm going to demand a public apology from him when I provide that evidence, and I will provide it at the next meeting. We collected dinosaur bones, some of which we excavated ourselves. We took different parts of the bone. For example, we excavated ourselves in Montana a Triceratops femur. We took different parts of the bone. We submitted it to a world-class lab that has an accelerated mass spectrometer that can count the number of carbon-14 and carbon-12 atoms in the sample. And as with every other sample that we sent to 5 different world-class labs, that we got the result that the dinosaur bones contain substantial amounts of carbon-14. And it's very well documented. We were invited 3 different times to present this data at AGU conferences, once in San Francisco and twice in Singapore. And so I'm going to present that before the meeting. I'm going to present it at the next meeting, and I'm going to demand a public apology from you for slandering the scientists who did this research. Now, to give an example to the audience of the kind of prejudice that exists, there was one university lab that when they found out that what we had sent them was dinosaur bones, wrote a letter to one of our scientists and said, "We found out that you are using this data to argue that dinosaurs existed thousands of years ago, so we can no longer do any more testing for you." That's tells you something right there. And we learned, you give the bones, you do not tell them that it's a dinosaur bone. And so I also want to ask you a question. And the question is this: how far below the surface does water lose its acidity? Do you know the answer?
You can answer that, Brenden.
Not off the top of my head.
Okay, well, it's a very important question because water loses its acidity 10 meters below the surface, and the cave systems go far deeper than that. The reason we have the cave systems is because of the flood and the fact that the flood created the channels through which the water flowed to create the cave systems all over the earth. the uniformitarian explanation doesn't, excuse the pun, hold water.
All right, that is time. So Brenden, your 5-minute closing statement begins now.
Yeah, so a few things with this. First of all, the rate of deposition is absolutely not the point of the stalactite stalagmite. It is the fact that when water seeps below the surface, when water forms in the atmosphere, rain comes down, it seeps below the surface and then forms these stalactite stalagmites. It carries information with it about the atmosphere. We can study that information. I will provide the link for how this was done. But we can study that information. We can tell whether or not that rain fell during a wet season or during like summer or winter based off of the barometric data that's in the oxygen that the water carries. It's just like tree rings. We can look at the data that the water leaves us. It's not about uniformity. It's not about how long it must have taken for that to form. It's about the data that it gives. Because if we can see a clear, okay, it's shifted now. This is no longer rain that fell during the summer. This is now rain that fell during the winter. And we can see that enough times for it to add up to 100,000 years, then we are not dealing with an issue where we are questioning uniformity. We are questioning instead why the atmosphere, unlike anything we know, changed so rapidly to inflate those results, right? Why did this area that has very clear, very predictable atmospheric changes between summer and winter just not do that for a while, I guess, where it changed so rapidly and then also calcified, which by the way takes a little time for that to calcify, right? It's ridiculous. It would be like seeing a tree that was 60,000 years and just going, oh, yeah, no, after the 6,000 year mark, after the 10,000 year mark, after like 6,000 years, the last like period of this time, there just, were 10 seasons every year. And that's the explanation. Yeah, absolutely. No, it doesn't work like that. So repeatedly, we've seen in this debate an accusation of uniformity. The problem is that we are not expecting uniformity, right? We are expecting that the laws of physics work as the laws of physics. We are expecting that the laws of mathematics work as the laws of mathematics. We're not expecting uniformity. Rather, we are expecting massive changes, right? We are expecting that there's a reason why there are fossilized tropical plants in Arctic regions, right? And we can trace that. We can see evidences of an ice age. We can see evidences of continental drift. We are expecting massive changes. The thing is, changes can be demonstrated. We can find volcanic layers in rock to demonstrate that a volcanic eruption occurred. We can find evidence that floodwater washed a new layer in, right? Based off of how the soil is sorted, based off of how it's disrupted, based off of any number of reasons. We are not expecting uniformity. Rather, what we are expecting is that if there are breaks to uniformity, that those breaks can be indicated. Right? If water seems to consistently be dripping into a cave system, forming these stalactites, stalagmites, and we have a way to be able to test those and see, the seasons that those are connected to, we would expect on particularly dry years that we would see less development. We would expect on particularly like wet years, we would see more development. We would not expect uniformity. Instead, we would expect that as nature itself changes, that we can see those changes, that we can document those changes. We just don't have that, right? We don't, I have brought up multiple lines of evidence here. I've brought up radiometric dating. I brought up the heat problem. I brought up the issue with dating through stalagmites, through caves, and connected to the orbital monsoon hypothesis, and I have discussed the number of different species. Specifically, I brought up plankton, right? None of those were addressed. Instead, what we got in this debate were a series of pieces of evidence that have been long debunked, that have been specifically dealt with in multiple sources previously, right? And that all of which are explainable. We have not heard an answer to the 4 lines of evidence that I submitted, but every line of evidence that has been brought up to support a younger Earth, all of them have already been demonstrably dealt with. And then very, very briefly, just to respond to Hugh Owen's claim, I did not assert that all examples of these dinosaur bones were extracted or submitted dishonestly. What I did say is that in that one particular example, they snuck in and pretended to be chemists, got dinosaur bones, and that's one of the major studies. I apologize if that was not clear, but no, I'm definitely not stating that that is what happened every time. What I am stating is that every time those results have been submitted, there have been very good reasons why, if there is demonstrable carbon-14, why that is explainable in a way that is not that the dinosaur lived a couple thousand years ago.
All right, and that's time. So Kevin and Hugh, you have 5 minutes to give your closing statement starting now.
You want to go first, Brother Kevin?
No, you can, Hugh, if that's all right.
So the reason why it was so important to demonstrate that there's a supernatural explanation for the origin of life, and there's no natural explanation for the origin of life that holds water, is because it points to the fact that we need a supernatural point of view to explain the origin of nature. You can't explain nature in terms of nature. And it's when you look at the revelation that we have from God that you're given the ability to establish the proper framework. We're told in 2 Peter chapter 3 that scoffers will come in the latter days with 2 errors. With one principal error, their principal error is going to be things have always been the same from the beginning of the universe. And because of that, they're going to deny the supernatural creation of all things, and they're going to deny the global flood. Now, the reason that we find carbon-14 in everything that's been tested is not because there's some explanation, as Brenden suggests, that explains this away. That is totally false. And I'll refer everybody to our papers, and you can see that every attempt to explain the data in some other way than that the dinosaurs in the coal existed thousands of years ago doesn't hold water. But the point is that given reasonable extrapolations, Brenden has not been able to explain the evidence that we've presented. When you look at the decay of the Earth's magnetic field, and you look at the carbon-14 dating results that we obtain consistently for coal, for dinosaur bones, for everything that's been carbon-14 tested, it fits perfectly within the biblical framework. Brenden claims that there are explanations that show that this is all bogus or something, but that's simply not true. You can look at the explanations and our answers, and you see that that's simply not the case. And the fact of the matter is that in the remains of plants and animals that have been found, we have found intact DNA, which has a half-life in laboratory conditions of 5,000 years, 521 years rather, and that means 10 half-lives gives you 5,000 to 10,000 years max for DNA to be preserved. This evidence in and of itself is another clear indication that the entire fossil record was laid down very rapidly. And when you look at the contents of the geological column, like the coal seams, the salt deposits, the chalk deposits, there is nothing comparable to this type of deposition going on now or in any period of recorded history over the last 4,000 years. But it's perfectly consistent with the global flood. And it's the global flood that explains why so many things that Brenden tries to explain in terms of presently observed processes actually occurred very rapidly. Over to Kevin.
Okay. Just regarding the points brought up, the number of species on the Earth is not at all a problem for the creation scenario, because in the beginning, we had a great amount of variety in creatures, and there have been a great amount of variety of different creatures that have lived over the history of the world. So we should expect to see a huge variety that have thankfully been preserved for us as they've been fossilized in the flood. The heat problem and the radioactivity problem, admittedly, those are problems if you are trying to solve them from a purely naturalistic or scientific point of view. However, we are not suggesting that the flood was a purely naturalistic phenomenon. We firmly believe that it was a disaster brought on by God himself as a judgment on the earth. And clearly he didn't want to destroy the entire earth in terms of never allowing anything to flourish there again. And he didn't intend to destroy the 8 people who survived on the ark. So clearly he would have miraculously preserved them and what was left of the earth after the flood. Regarding just generally science in general, if you're going to base your worldview and your philosophy and your outlook on life and how you live your life based upon contemporary science, you're going to be sadly disappointed, because no one in their right mind would even trust a science textbook that is 100 years old. So where will we be 100 years from now? Everyone, all of the scientists will have to throw practically everything out the window, and they'll have different theories and hypotheses that they rely on. So it's shifting sand to have that as your foundation. What you need as your foundation is Jesus Christ, the King of the universe, who is the only explanation that makes any sense. You need a power that is almighty, all powerful, to create what we live in. And if you want to suggest that nothing created everything, then go for it. But that is not a scientific argument, and that makes no sense.
All right, and that's time. So that concludes the formal debate. And if you're all available, I'd like to have an informal post-debate discussion. Would you all, do any of you need to leave anytime soon, or are you all available for a little while longer?
I could stay for 5 minutes, but I really couldn't stay any longer than that.
Okay, and how about you, Kevin?
I could probably stay for maybe like 10 or 15.
Okay, so so with that in mind, we'll keep it kind of brief. But Hugh, as you know, in the schedule next week, we have we're going to be talking about whether traditional age creationism is the correct interpretation of Genesis, and then the week after that, we have whether dinosaurs were alive less than 10,000 years ago. And you mentioned that you were going to give some dinosaur-related evidence at the beginning of the next meeting. Do you think it would work well to have the dinosaur debate next week, so that would fit well into it, or do you already have somebody lined up for next week?
No, I can just wait until 2 weeks from today to bring the dinosaur evidence. That's fine.
Okay, great. And then also, so there were a lot of points brought up that Brenden said were not within the scope of this debate, which was strictly on the age of the Earth. And now that the formal debate is over, I was wondering, Brenden, would you like to respond to some of those arguments that, and I know that you'll have the opportunity to in future debates, but maybe just as a way of showing what you're going to debate in those future talks, if you could address some of those now. It's up to you, though, if you'd like to.
I mean, I can try briefly. I didn't write most of them down since they weren't in the scope of the debate, but I mean, genetic entropy is a great one because it's just false. Like he's been disproven over and over again on the genetic entropy point. The mutations being largely harmful, the idea that the genetic code being like the idea that genetics or mutations changing doesn't create new information. Like all of these things are very old talking points that are easily and demonstrably false. I mean, lactose tolerance is an example of a genetic mutation that has produced good, beneficial, good is a bad word for it, but beneficial effects in humans, right? We can process dairy. It's great. That's otherwise, I mean, most, like I said, I didn't really write most of it down because it wasn't in the scope of our conversation. But yes, yeah, abiogenesis is very well supported, and there's a lot of research that indicates how the DNA code, genetic code, would arise from what we have been able to demonstrate and replicate within the lab.
Okay, well, I just say to that if you go to the link that I gave you, Dr. Carter and Dr. Sanford have refuted Erica and Swami Das and all the rest of them. I don't see their response. So please show me. I want to see exactly where Swami Das and Erica and the rest of them have actually responded to the specific points that Dr. Carter and Dr. Sanford have made in their response. It's not enough for you to just say, oh, that's been refuted, that's all garbage. I want you to show me exactly where each and every point that they've made has been rebutted.
Yeah, and so important.
It's going to be acceptable.
Right,
and
so
the
importantly,
thing is, when it comes to chemicals turning into code, it's not enough to say there's a lot of research out there. We need to see, we're talking about science. Please show us an experiment where code arose from chemicals. And finally, the example you gave of lactose intolerance or lactose tolerance, it's not a new function. If you analyze what's happening at the genetic level, it's just a modification of existing genetic information. You need to be able to provide to us examples of totally new functions arising. And all the examples you're going to show us, if you give them to us, we'll be able to come back and show you, no, in every single case, an existing function is being broken or deregulated. It's not an instance of a totally new function coming into existence. And on that point, Dan, I've got to go.
Okay, great. Thanks so much for joining us, Hugh. We'll see you next time.
God bless.
Yeah. All right, thanks. And do you have anything you'd like to discuss with Kevin while you still have a few minutes left? Just as our post.
You know what, can I just bring up briefly, so genetic entropy, one of the things that you'll find when you look in the literature, I'm talking just secular literature, when you look up the mutation rate that is happening currently from one generation to the next, specifically in humans, it is very evident that there are a ton of mutations going on, far more than evolutionists thought would be the case. I mean, basically on the low end of the spectrum, I think the lowest I have ever seen is 30-something fixed mutations per generation. And the higher end of the spectrum is around 160 mutations per generation. I see no way that that is not degenerating the species, because all of these are harmful. How, when these are relentlessly building up generation after generation, this has been empirically shown now that we can analyze the genetics of one generation to the next, how are these buildup of mutations not degenerating our genome?
Yeah, I mean, it's really simple. I was with you all the way up until you said most of these are harmful. That's just demonstrably false. Most of them, no, it is. Most of them are entirely benign. Most of them have no effect really whatsoever, right? Like so a mutation is just any time that the code is not copied properly. Most of the time, those, like the genetic code not being copied properly, does nothing, right? It's just that part's not being read. There's backups for that and nothing happens. Then on top of that, sometimes they're harmful and sometimes they're beneficial, right? So the majority of them are benign, most of them are neutral, but sometimes we have some that are harmful, sometimes we have some that are helpful. Most of the time, those are also in extraordinarily minor ways, right? I mean, like, I have blue eyes, I have blonde hair. Both of those are mutations. They're not negative. They're also not really all that beneficial, other than perhaps, I mean, to attract a mate, you know, having like girls with green eyes are especially cute. That's, you know, guys that are tall are especially attractive, I've heard. Like, sometimes that can be helpful, beneficial for survival, right? That's what natural selection is. It doesn't have to only produce good things, but it does just have to be more beneficial for survival than not. Right? Losing all of your hair is a very negative thing if you're in the Arctic. It's a very positive thing if you're in the Sahara, right? And so that's one of the issues here too, is that like negative, positive is a very subjective point of view depending on the setting. A mutation that is harmful or negative in one environment could be the most beneficial in another. So it's just simply not true that most of these are negative.
It's very easy for me to demonstrate that is the case. Obviously, it is certainly the case that most of these we are not able to visually see the effect in terms of saying, because we don't understand the exact function of all the genome enough to be able to say what it does. However, it is very clear that most of these are not adding beneficial mutations, and thus even a so-called neutral mutation is not actually neutral because your body is having to expend energy to basically keep this useless genetics going. So how is that not going to put a drain on your system over time, first of all? And I mean, second of all, you can't actually seriously be suggesting that all of these mutations that we are witnessing, that they're, I mean, I'm not talking about mutations that are adding a beneficial effect. I mean, you can just see these mutations going on that are clearly random mutations that not a single scientist I've ever seen has ever even suggested that any of these could be possibly beneficial. In terms of what I'm talking about, human mutations from one generation to the next. That's what I'm talking about. But these specifically observed mutations where they are counting these as part of the mutation rate that's being fixed in one generation to the next.
Absolutely. You mean like lactose tolerance? How is that not beneficial? How is it not beneficial for a people group who are surrounded by animals like cows who need a consistent, renewable source of food? How is it not beneficial for them to develop the mutation that they can process lactose beyond just their childhood? How is that not beneficial?
Well, we're talking about just like what Hugh said. I mean, a broken type of gene situation. This is not the type of mutation going from one generation to the next that is being observed in these mutation studies. I mean, that what you're talking about is something that typically has happened in the past and now is fixed and is sort of being passed down.
Yeah, that's a mutation that's been passed down generation to generation. Yes.
It's
well,
degenerating
and also,
our genome.
Well, hold on. It's also important to note a mutation is not necessarily breaking. It could be double copying. It could be moving. It could be any number of things in the genetic code. It doesn't just have to be broken. The use the words, and a lot of times these words are used that are very inflammatory, or very like coded to be positive or negative, to make a point that is just not the point of a scientific mutation, right? Like a mutation is not just the breaking of code. But in the case of lactose tolerance, yeah, there's a mutation in our genetic code. It changed our genetic code, and that change of genetic code was beneficial and thus passed down through childbearing, right? Our genetic code is copied from us to our children. Well, our genetic code is mixed with the genetic code of whoever we make a child with, and the child is a mixture of the two genetic codes. Sometimes that doesn't copy correctly, but when you have something that is beneficial, it tends to stick around longer, because if you're starving and I can drink milk and live, and you can drink milk and, die, I'm going to live and you're going to die. I'm going to have more children, you're not. And we know, like, if you are from areas that were or that did have these animals, this mutation was more likely to develop, and it didn't develop in populations that didn't have access to lactose, and then it was passed on, which is why we have it today. So it's it's not just.
But you're suggesting that this is just, first of all, that if this is proven to be some sort of random, spontaneous thing. And what we're finding when we study genetics is that a lot of these changes and mutations, if you want to call it that, actually seem to be designed into systems. So, I mean, what is to say that that wasn't part of the functioning of the creature in the beginning, that the mutation acted like an on or off switch for something already put in there?
I mean, what is that claim then, that what creatures were created in such a way that they have a genetic code that can mutate, can change from what God's perfect design was, in ways that occasionally can break in very horrible ways, but occasionally can also produce things that are beneficial, right? Like, it's the mutations are random, the selection isn't, and that's one of the things that's important to note, that sometimes gets missed in conversations between younger and older, right, or evolution, non-evolution, is that the mutation process is random, right? 30 to 160 random mutations. Whether or not those stick around to keep getting passed on isn't so random.
That may be the case, but you're just kind of, you're acting like this is somehow something that is not able to be handled within a creationist paradigm, when this type of variability that could be triggered by mutations is somehow outside the scope of creators' ability to design, when that's clearly within creationism, because that's how we got different varieties of, for instance, like polar bears were formed just through this various type of mechanism. So what we see here is a limited amount of variation within a created kind. You're not bringing forth any type of idea of a mutation advancing an organism into some sort of higher level.
No, that's not what I was asked to demonstrate. To be clear, that's a straw man. What I was demonstrating was a specific response to your specific question. However, there is a preponderance of evidence that could be presented as well to demonstrate that, first of all, there doesn't seem to be any limitation on these mutations, what they can do. It's not the case. We can adapt to any environment, and with enough time, in theory, seems like there's no limitations on that, other than the limitations of physics, right? So like Kent Hovind, if you know him, like, he likes to bring up really dumb talking points about how we can't, like, create a pig the size of Texas. Well, no, obviously physics exists as well, right? Like, the limits of physics are going to always limit that. But otherwise, there doesn't seem to be any specific limits on that. But we do see, like, the other issue there is the use of the word kind. So the word kind gets thrown around a lot, but, like, and maybe you have a specific definition. I'm just curious, what do you mean kind? Like, what's a kind?
A kind is an organism that is able to be crossbred to some degree with another organism.
Okay, so we know in our lifetimes, right, observably, there's a population of squirrels that kind of migrated west in the US. Some took up residence north of the Grand Canyon, some took up residence south of the Grand Canyon. After some generations had gone by, they are no longer able to crossbreed. The genetic mutations that have occurred through the population have allowed them to breed within their own populations, not within themselves. Are those two different kinds of squirrel?
No, they're the same kind because they came from the original same kind. And if
Okay.
and I'm not talking necessarily about a natural ability to crossbreed, that it could be done artificially and you would have some degree of fertilization going on, even if it couldn't live all the way out to full term.
All right, so you're saying that they belong to the same kind because they have a common ancestor that mutations have just caused to no longer be able to crossbreed.
Essentially, yes.
Right. So why do you stop that, right? Like you've just created one of those evolutionary trees. You just keep going, right? Like we can, and
Well, yeah,
you'd
but
expect if you could keep
you
going.
can't crossbreed anything together. You can do experiments in the lab where you take sperm and egg from one creature and another, and you can tell, are these things actually able to create offspring in any way? And if they're not, if there's absolutely no ability, clearly these are from separate kinds. If they are, then it is quite a reasonable inference to say these originally came from the same ancestor.
Right, but I mean, like I said, with the squirrels, right? Like they no longer can crossbreed. You can't do it. It's just they don't do it. We have other similar examples. The wolf, like the American breed of wolf, can no longer crossbreed with some of the other wild dogs that are all dogs. They would probably all be considered part of the dog kind, but they can't crossbreed.
But are you saying, are you trying to suggest that I don't believe that speciation occurs?
No, what I'm trying to suggest is that you believe that speciation occurs, and then you put an artificial line there, right? Like artificially, there's just this line where speciation can occur, but somehow stays within the same kind. But kind is super ambiguous, right? Because there's this just imaginary line, right? So sure, dog kind might exist, but would you say that dogs and bears are of the same kind?
Of course not, because you can't crossbreed any type of dog with any type of bear.
Sure, I can't crossbreed some types of dogs with some types of dogs.
I just said that you could do it artificially. And
no, there are no very specifically.
If you use any type of dog in the laboratory, you will be able to get some sort of fertilization occurring when you mix the sperm with the egg, if you do it enough times.
There are examples of speciation where the divide is great enough that you just can't do that. That's just not the case. You can't just breed everything. Like there is no delineation between what would be considered kinds. Like that's the thing, is there's just, well, I mean, we can look at things like, other than breeding tests, we can look at things like genetics, right? Like we would say that genetics works in a similar way, right? That's why paternity tests work. That's why you can.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not arguing with you that genetics couldn't be used to differentiate, to help you determine what is part of one kind from another. It could be a very useful tool. I'm just telling you kind of the gold standard in general, which is the ability for something to crossbreed. At one point, they would have come from the same kind. I mean, obviously, we're coming from two different perspectives. If you think that everything in the world came from the same ancestor, and I don't.
I mean, we're not coming from two, like, that's kind of the point I'm trying to get at. Is we're not coming from two different perspectives. Like this is, like, I don't like kind of these, and I'm very familiar with these, right? There's kind of these accusations that there's this, like, this bias, you're coming from this perspective, so you're reaching this perspective. I came from a young earth creationist, anti-evolutionist perspective, and I came out of that. What changed my mind wasn't some like decision to jump ship. What changed my mind was data. I'm not coming to this with a like perspective in mind. I'm coming at this with data, but more than that, I mean, it seems to me like you and I are in agreement in the idea of a common ancestor. The disagreement comes in that I would draw those connections above this arbitrary line, right? And I would draw those connections using the other tests that we have at our disposal, like genetics, right? Like we can genetically compare something like a dog to a bear, and we could say, okay, genetically, are these things similar? And we find, oh, they are similar. Well, that's funny because they have some similar features too. And man, if we go and we look at some of these fossils, they're pretty like, they look like some mix of dog and bear. So now we have like fossils that look like dog bears. We have in real life, we can see differences between dog and bear, and genetically they're similar. And if we compare a dog to I'm trying to think of to a platypus, and we go, hey, they aren't all that similar. We don't have any like dog platypi, and they aren't genetically similar, right? So and that helps us to get beyond even just speciation. But in theory, in speciation, right? Because like we give these names of like dog kind to things, right? We kind of give these group names together. No such like group really exists.
But all of these groups that scientists have come up with are essentially arbitrary in one way or another. I mean, whether it's species, genera, go up the list. I mean, you have to have some way of categorizing these things.
Sure.
But I mean, that's where, at least in the creationist perspective, you at some point you have to realize that this isn't purely genetics or biology. I mean, first of all, yeah, I understand what you're saying. I mean, it's basically an argument of homology, where you're looking at similarity of structure, similarity of things in the genetics, and you're saying, okay, this looks like this, and then you're making the jump, therefore this came from this, where that I'm not willing to make that jump, because to me, common design suggests a common designer, not necessarily a common ancestor. Now, it could be a common ancestor. I'm not saying that that is, because within the kind, that makes sense to me. But when getting back to philosophy, there's such a thing as essences. There's such a thing as natures, the nature of something, the essence of what makes something what it is. And there are natures of creatures and human beings, for instance. And this is where philosophically lines can be drawn, which these lines all get thrown out the window if you want to say that there's really no such thing as any static creature, that if something is constantly in flux, then you can just throw that philosophy out the window, and I'm not willing to do that.
Yeah, I mean, like I've read a lot of philosophy, right? Like the Greek philosophers, which are kind of the region I'm most familiar with, made arguments about how, because fire has, you know, the nature of movement, and water has a nature, and earth has a nature, and we see these things reflected, that we are quintessential beings of, you know, 5 natures, that we are made of fire, earth, water, and air, because we are in fire, earth, water, air, and spirit, right? We move, so we have fire, right? And some of the, you know, we're hot, so we must have fire, right? Some of these things that we would look at now and we go, that's, I just can't see what you're getting at, but we would throw it out because the data doesn't support that, right? I don't think it is a good idea. The idea that the Earth was in the center of the universe, that came from philosophy, right? The philosophical idea there is that we are the philosophical theological idea is that we are the center of God's creation. We are the special piece of God's creation, and therefore we would be the center of the universe. And that was highly contested. It wasn't even until like, I think the 1900s that the Catholic Church had finally officially like took a stance on it. They just kind of stopped talking about it before that. But right, but this, you know, we have to be careful not to come to a philosophical claim that sounds nice to us and fits what we want, but then ignore data that goes with that. And I don't see any conclusive data that the same paternity test that works over and over again just stops at some point.
Well, I mean, it clearly, if you take creatures and you put them together, like I said, in a lab, sperm and egg, and there's no crossbreeding whatsoever, I mean, you would have to at least admit from your perspective that they could only be distantly related.
I mean, I don't know, just it would depend on the circumstances, right? Because there's factors that go into that can make that complicated, where it's such a like some mutations in the population can be severe enough to make that like less distant. But sure, like they're not, I can say that they're not in the same species. I could say that speciation's occurred.
But the thing that you're getting back to, your statement that you believe there's no limit to what mutations and these changes can accomplish, that's demonstrably false. I mean, you look at the experiments that scientists have been doing on fruit flies, for instance, for 100 years. They've been doing everything possible to mutate fruit flies into something that is beyond the fruit fly. And essentially all they have been able to accomplish are a handful of either harmful mutations or mutations that don't seem to give any real selective advantage. This is probably the most studied creature that exists in the world. And it's just like any other breeding experiment where you've reached the end of a dog breed. You can't get any more pure than a purebred because they're already weak genetically. So why exactly, where does this idea come from that there's no limit to this?
Because
like empirically,
yeah.
Where are you getting this idea from?
Because we see no limit, right? Like the fruit flies experiments are specifically testing, experimenting with specific things, with specific criteria, changes to the environment, right? But there are bacteria, we have experience with things like bacteria that do show pretty extensive changes. There was one experiment that was done in which they removed the flagellum and it just developed another type of flagellum, right? Like they took that out of the genetic code, they took it out, cut it out. The bacteria had no flagellum, and because it was beneficial to their environment to have more mobility, right, that they developed a different like type of movement system. We have examples of these. Now it's harder to like point to with larger creatures because their lifespans are longer, right? But even then, we can see lots of evidences of these things, right? We can see plenty of evidences of changes over time. I mean, I don't know if you've ever seen, for instance, like the hands of a, I want to say ostrich, it might be emu, one of the two, right? Where they like, they have little hands, they have little arms, they're tiny, they don't do anything, they're just kind of like there, only like that big, right? They're like itty bitty. But it seems to indicate that at some point they had arms.
Well, that's one explanation, but alternatively, it's just the classic vestigial organ argument, where if we don't know what something does, let's just assume it's useless, which is generally a bad argument. I mean, let's just look into these things. Let's actually start seeing what does it actually do. I mean, in many cases, in most cases, these things do turn out to have functions.
Yes, sorry. That actually reminds me, I wanted to come back to one of the points that was made. Yeah, evolution doesn't state that these things just don't have functions. They just change function, right? Like they like generally we still are able to like find a use for, the body adapts a use for something that no longer has the same function, but still has a function. We can see this, I mean, most clearly we see this in the like fossil record with whales, right? Where like if you look at whales, like whales have finger bones. Well, they don't need finger bones for their fins. There are plenty of animals that have fins that don't have finger bones. But what's happened is that they have gone from having legs to those legs adapting to fins, right? So the finger bones are still like an effective way, not the best way, but it's an effective way to get around. So yeah, it still has function. Like, sure, absolutely, they still have function. That doesn't mean that that is the ideal function. It certainly doesn't mean that that function didn't develop from something else.
Well, in the early 1900s, evolutionists had developed a list of 180 vestigial organs that humans have that were, it was argued that they have become completely useless.
Yeah.
And this is an example of how evolution has stunted science. And
Yeah.
then look at how they ended up taking out people's appendices and people's tonsils practically willy-nilly, almost prophylactically at times, because they thought these things were useless. Why? Because they were bought into this philosophy of vestigial organs that was based upon evolutionary theory. So it's
Sure,
generally
but
speaking not a good system to just assume that. And I understand, I agree with you if that's what you're arguing.
right. And then it was scientists who studied those and found that they in fact weren't completely useless. However, like there are people who are benefited by the removal of their tonsils. There are people who are benefited by the removal of their appendices, right? Like they are not essential, but they are, in fact, I think the appendix isn't even vestigial. We'll have to debate that, right? But we do have other things like the fact that our optic nerve doesn't connect to our brain. It goes down and around to connect to our brain, right? Like, man, that's useless.
Well, again,
just went
you
straight,
can't
would
just
have been.
say it's useless just because we don't know something doesn't
But we
mean
do.
that
No, but we
can't.
do know it, right? Because we see it in other animals in which it just connects. It's easier, right? or
Well,
perhaps
I've
the
read
fact
an
that
article from an optometrist on this very point, that where he makes a sound argument that this is actually a good design. So it's not an irrefutable fact. Is what I'm saying.
sure. I'd be super interested to read that if you could pass my way. But I think my favorite example of something like that is the fact that the urethra is right against the prostrate for men. This gland that when you get older has a very high tendency to inflame and swell, thus pinching the urethra. Like there are plenty of other animal species in which that's not the case. That seems like for them that works kind of a little bit better.
So then why would we have evolved that then if we're at the top of the food chain?
Because it's not, it doesn't change productivity, or sorry, reproductivity.
But you just
right?
said it's dangerous.
Yeah, when we get older. So we tend to have the most problems with genetics. We tend to have that when we get older, right? When we get past prime childbearing. Because
well, that would still be killing the population in general, because the older generation would help the rest survive.
Potentially, but not necessarily. I mean, goodness, we have like spider species, like what the black widow kills the mate and then leaves. So like there are plenty of species in which there's not even a parental unit around. But so no, like mutations that occur after you've exited childbearing years don't tend to necessarily, like they don't have as many ways to work themselves out. And in fact, if the older generation dies out, they use fewer resources. If they're using fewer resources, that means that's more resources available for the young. So actually, it can be extremely beneficial if the old die out, especially if you're in a like agrarian hunter-gatherer civilization, right? If you're living like harvest to harvest, man, it's kind of nice when when Pop dies and suddenly I can eat food without having to worry about starving. If Pop just kept living another 20 years and now we've got like great grandkids in the house, it becomes a lot harder to survive.
Well, thank God I don't ascribe to a Malthusian view of reality, is all I can say, because that would be very depressing if I ever got to the point where I could think that these evolutionary thoughts should in any way be beneficial to me or to my progeny, to be perfectly honest. I think that that's a good example of how evolutionary thinking makes us less human. It makes us more animal-like, because if you live your life according to this view, why wouldn't you kill your enemies? Why wouldn't you want to get rid of your neighbor if you don't like him, if he's causing you harm? Why wouldn't it be tooth for tooth? And just like the most horrible environment imaginable, why wouldn't we just throw out any concept of altruism or love? And I mean, I know the evolutionary argument, oh, well, altruism kind of helps the population. Well, and then it's a purely selfish. Is there no such thing as being completely unselfish for the sole purpose of loving someone else? I mean, that's where Christianity has guided Western society, and that's where atheism has resulted in the murders of countless people in these school shootings. I'm just not understanding.
Most of those have been proclaiming Christians.
How, I mean, honestly, are you, like, this is going a little bit off topic here, but
Sure.
Are you actually happy in this atheism? Like, does it give you joy?
Yeah, so a few things there. Number one, just because we see something does happen in nature, right, doesn't mean that we should extrapolate that philosophy from it, right? Like, it's just a fact. If you're in economic, like if you are, say, living through the Black Plague, and there's not enough food to go around, and people in your house will die, you're going to have a better chance of surviving because you have food. They're not taking that from you, right? That's not so much that's not a philosophical statement whatsoever. That's just nature. I mean, similarly, right, to today's questions about childbirth and childbearing, is if you only have, if you're being severely underpaid, if you have a job that's just not making enough money, and you introduce 3 kids to that life, it's going to be harder to get by because you're not going to have enough money for everything, right? You're more likely to be malnourished, all that. That's not philosophy. That's just having some level of scarcity. It can be, some level of some biological mechanism in place to stop from over-consuming resources is beneficial in some circumstances. Not so much now that we're able to produce those resources to such a degree that we're able to overcome a lot of that. Right, we're no longer just agrarian societies, but the philosophy of that is different, right? The philosophy of no, with potential conversations about if there's 3 of us trapped on a mountain and all 3 of us are going to starve, and we know that we're not going to be able to get away whatsoever, is it right? But if we can make it 3 weeks past when we were going to starve, if we kill one of the 3, then 2 get to survive. If we don't, none of them survive, right? Like questions like that, it's a little bit more complicated, I think. But yeah, I mean, after that, I think philosophy is super important. Once we've dealt with the facts and data, I think philosophy is super important at helping us to understand how to interact with people, right? But yeah, evolution, I mean, you mentioned it briefly, right? Evolution of social species involves things like empathy and altruism and all that, because they help us, right? We get a nice little fuzzy feeling that makes us want to do them. That fuzzy feeling feels better than the bad feeling we feel when we see bad things happen to people we consider to be part of our in-group. We can manipulate that too. We can manipulate who is considered in our in-group and who isn't, right? We can expand our in-group so that we have that empathy for everyone, and we can limit that so that we see, some people as other and worthy of that torture and death. but that is very, explainable evolutionarily. As far as my personal happiness, yeah. I mean that. So I take serious issues with the morality of the Bible. Right? We see. I mean, you want to talk about murder? God, on 2 separate occasions, blatantly commands that his people murder every man, woman, child, and infant, right? Like stabbing babies in their cradle doesn't seem like a moral good. It doesn't seem like a thing that we should want to do. It seems like that causes a decent amount of trauma to the people who do it, and kind of stops the people who it was done to from living. We see instances where check that, like, kill every man, woman, child, and infant, except for, kill all the men. Any of the women who have had sex, any of the women who haven't had sex, which, by the way, the way to check that is extraordinarily horrifying and traumatizing, right? But the women who haven't had sex, take them for yourselves, right? We see if a man sells his daughter into slavery, then the master gets to choose whether she marries him, marries his son, or whether he lets the family buy her back. And if he just decides not to do any of them, then he has to set her free. If a man enters into debt slavery, and then his master gives him a wife, and then he has a child with that wife, when he leaves debt slavery, his wife and child don't. There is no end to that. The child is born into slavery and stays in slavery. And the only recourse the man has is to give himself as a chattel slave permanently for life, voluntarily, to the master. Otherwise, there is no recourse. He just loses his family, right? Like, these are the kinds of morals that are in the biblical law, that are things that God commands and that just don't really seem all that great. Like, I don't want to live in that society. I'd much rather.
But you do realize, of course, that Christians don't live by that, nor are bound by any of those things that you're talking about.
Sure, but Christians do believe that Jesus did not come to abolish the law, but to fulfill it, right? We also, there have been papal encyclicals that have talked about, if these things are not off limits because the Bible commands them, right? Especially if you take kind of the inerrantist position of the Bible. At the very least, the same God as the God of Christianity commanded that those things be done. And so even if we wanted to say that we don't live under that, although the slavery one specifically, there is nothing in the New Testament that specifically abolishes slavery. And in fact, the one instance that we have of Paul even actually talking about slavery, Paul says, hey, I could tell you to just, give him away, but I'm not going to do that. Just, if you would do it as a favor for me, because he had become Christian, not because slavery is wrong, right?
Yeah, well, there is an answer to this in terms of a broad answer, and that is, this life is just temporary, and we don't see the big picture. And if we live our lives according to this short-term view, quite frankly, there's a lot of things that probably aren't going to make sense to us. But if you were to think of the bigger picture in terms of eternity, in terms of the afterlife, I know you probably don't believe in that, but if you think of it that from that conception, then everything is made right in the end.
Sure. But if I think about it from that perception, right, it's a very fuzzy feel good, everything is made right in the end, and that makes us kind of feel nice about the afterlife. But if you reach heaven and your children aren't there, you really experiencing that much joy? At least if you are you, right? Now, sure, we can say that God could change you so that you don't remember them, or in some other way like alter who you are. But if you're in heaven and you know that your children didn't make it because they just weren't convinced, right? Then
yeah, but I mean, that would be, that's suggesting that we would be in the same state in heaven as we are now. And it's
yes, it is.
again, once again, though, it's not believing that God will make everything right. So if you actually believe that God will make everything right, then these secondary questions fall by the wayside, because you are just like, well, I know he's going to make that right too.
Sure. But that means either he is going to fundamentally change who we are, right? Like, we just aren't actually ourselves. In which case, I mean, that brings a whole lot of questions, right? Like, I'm not going to heaven. Some form of me that's going to be like changed, and there's something entirely unrecognizable that's going to be in heaven, right? That's first of all not what we see in the Bible, and second of all is kind of horrifying, right? That we would be forcibly changed so that we aren't, like, we wouldn't be able to recognize ourselves. The things we care about, the people we love, just don't matter to us anymore. But even that aside, like, sure, okay, if we're going to say that God makes all things right in the end, I mean, I am someone who has very actively searched for answers, still actively searches for answers, have found that when I've looked for answers, the answers that I've gotten haven't agreed with the Christianity I've been presented with, right? The Christianity that I see, the Bible, it just doesn't agree with the Bible. And so I've become unconvinced. It wasn't even an active decision. I didn't decide to just stop believing in God. I just realized, wait a second. I mean, it's similar to, grow up and you realize, wait, Santa's not real.
Yeah.
Right? It's not like you can then go convince yourself he is again.
Yeah, you're right. I can somewhat understand, because that's what it was when I became Catholic. I did not want to become Catholic. I hated the idea of becoming Catholic. I only became Catholic because I felt convinced that this is the truth. I have to go here, whether I want to or not. Thankfully, I feel very convinced that the Lord led me here. But I can understand what you're saying, and I believe you.
Right.
Yeah.
So if that's the case, then the God who makes all things right, would I be sent to be tortured for eternity? Because despite all of my best efforts and all of my research and all of the work and time that I've put into this, I wasn't convinced, right? Am I to be tortured for that? And if no, then, man, it seems like I shouldn't kind of worry about it at all. Shouldn't worry about the questions at all, right? Like, I've done my due diligence. And if yes, then how can we say that God makes all things right when he is willing to torture for eternity, right? Which is its own big issue I have, but right, to torture for eternity someone who rejected him because he just didn't know he existed. He just wasn't convinced. He looks at the evidence, really tries, genuinely does his best, and just comes away with it going, I have too many question marks for me to think that this is real.
Yeah, well, again, I would say that that's not an accurate view of God or who he is or how he will judge. If we truly believe that he is who he says he is, that he is all-powerful, almighty, all-knowing, then again, he has to make things right 100% in the end. There can be not a single error in his judgment or how things come down. And so we might not be able to understand it, but we certainly can trust that his judgment in the end will be right. And so, I mean, with that in mind, I certainly would agree with you that it would be unjust for any God to to cause someone to be tortured eternally for any unjust reason. So we must believe, therefore, that he would never do that. If a
Sure.
person's being tortured, it would be only for eternity. It could only be for a just reason, and only he could know exactly or understand that. But I mean, that's where I think sometimes we put God in a box, and we can't do that. We have to, I mean, keep at the top of our minds the theology, yes, but also the philosophy that if God is all good, he can never do a wrong.
Sure, and that's fair, and that was one of the few issues that I had a big deal with towards the beginning that actually became resolved. Like, I did become convinced that if God existed, that my understanding of hell must be wrong, right? Because that's very much the Protestant understanding, especially, although depending on who you're listening to, Catholic-wise, it's theirs as well, and it seems at points to be indicated as in the Bible. But I mean, in more direct answer, because I don't think I actually answered. I think we got tangented a little. Yeah, I find I'm actually quite a bit more happy as an atheist because I mean, for one, I find that I'm a lot less like, it feels a lot less like the world is just like out to get me. And that's allowed me to, like, you know, talk to people and realize that they're really not, and make friends and build kind of a bigger community. But also, I don't know, the kind of the idea that we only have one life, that there's not some eternity that we're going towards, has caused me to reevaluate a lot of the ways that I interact with people. Right? Because if there's not an eternity, it matters way more how I interact with them now, because I'm either going to improve their brief, fleeting existence, or I'm going to make it worse. And man, I don't want people to make my life worse. Why would I want to make it worse for someone else? And so so a lot of these things, like, there's a lot of these things, right, that we push on other people in the name of religion that make their lives worse. But the hope is that it makes their life worse now so that it makes it better later, or maybe not that it makes it better later, but it makes it worse now. But, you know, this is what God wants, right? So, like the transgender issue, right? You're not going to save anybody by keeping them from being able to express themselves or not. They're like, their mind's not going to get changed. But there's the idea that this is what God wants. God doesn't want this to be present in our country, so we must speak out against it. Well, I'm a lot more, I think, empathetic and kind of open to the idea that, yeah, like, I'm not going to try and make people's lives miserable, especially if it's just going to make them miserable, right? So, like, it'd be different if, you know, various different studies can come to mind that, you know, if there's something that would make somebody's, like, generally happier, but it's something that Christianity would consider immoral. Divorce might be a good one, right? There, you know, depending on the relationship, there might be reasons other than Scripture laying out, like abuse in the house, right? Verbal abuse in the house. It might make their life better to leave. And I can support them in that because I'm trying to make their life better and not worry about some eternal repercussions. That was a little bit rambly, sorry. But yeah, I do think I'm happier. And I think, statistically speaking, secular countries tend to have higher morale than religious ones.
I just wanted to interject and just say thank you, Dr. Kevin, for staying so much later. I didn't want to interrupt you guys because it was such a great discussion. If you need to leave at any point, feel free to, because I know you said you had to go. But I also have something I have to do in a few minutes. I can actually stay by the computer, so I can leave this meeting running a little longer if you want. But whatever works for you, though. So.
Yeah, you know what? I do have to get home to my family, I'm afraid, but
Okay.
I am. You know, thankful that we were able to have this discussion. And I was thinking about this guy, oh shoot, what's his name? Has a YouTube channel, Catholic Verses it's what it's called. It's David Ross. David Ross, he's a friend of mine. Anyways, when you're talking, I was just thinking you'd have a cool discussion with David Ross. Anyways, he's a really very good listener. Awesome. But would I be able to get your email address, Brenden, or no?
Oh, absolutely. If I put it in the chat, can you access that?
Yeah, I can.
Yeah, actually, I would love that. It was kind of sad with Jim Bertrand that we didn't exchange contact information at all, because there were some things I would have enjoyed, I think, having more of a conversation with him.
Yeah, I went to a lecture of his once. I liked it.
Yeah, he was a sweet guy, and he really wanted to know about like my journey out of Catholicism, and it wasn't in the scope of the debate, so we didn't get to talk about it much. But
yes.
Perfect.
Okay, well, thank you for the discussion. I got your email, and hopefully we can keep in touch, and you know, I wish God's blessing on you, and I want you to have a great night.
I appreciate it. I'll actually send you an email as soon as we finish this call, so we at least have that in our inbox. And I've appreciated your time and your consideration. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you, Brenden. Yeah, you too.
Great. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks, Dan.
All right. Bye.
All right. Bye, all.